He came home smelling like her perfume. Not a trace. Not a ghost of it. A full, deliberate cloud of another woman's scent clinging to his collar at 1 a.m, while his pregnant wife stood barefoot on cold kitchen tile, 34 weeks along, one hand resting over their unborn son, like she was already protecting him from what was coming. Simone Avery didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She asked one question in a voice so steady it should have frightened him more than tears ever could. "Are you still seeing her, Adrian?" He said nothing. And somehow, his silence was louder than a confession. If you have ever loved someone so completely that you stopped recognizing yourself, you have ever given everything and still wondered whether you were enough, stay with this story. Because what Simone did next will change the way you see strength forever. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. These are the stories that stay with you. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The kitchen smelled like expensive candles. Simone had lit earlier that evening because she needed something to do with her hands. She had spent the last 3 hours convincing herself she was wrong, that the texts she had half seen on Adrian's phone 2 weeks ago meant nothing, that the business dinners running past midnight were exactly what he said they were, that the particular way he'd stopped reaching for her in bed, not with cruelty, just with a kind of quiet, practiced absence, was simply the stress of a fourth quarter closing. She had spent 3 hours building a very careful lie to live inside. Then he walked through the door at 1:17 in the morning, and the lie collapsed the second the cold air followed him in. Simone didn't move from where she stood. She had been pouring a glass of water she didn't actually want, standing at the marble island that divided their kitchen like a courtroom, and she stayed exactly there, watching him hang his coat, watching him avoid her eyes with the particular skill of a man who had been practicing. "Long night," he said. Not a question. "Is it still Camille?" she asked, because she was done with the careful version of herself. Done with the version that waited, softened, gave the benefit of every doubt until there were no more doubts left to give. Adrian's hand stilled on his jacket lapel. That single pause, that half second of a man calculating, told her everything she needed. "Simone," he said. Her name like it was a thing he could manage, like it was a conversation he could steer. "Don't," she said. "Please don't say my name like you're about to explain something to me." He turned around then, and she saw it not guilt exactly, because guilt is just surprise, and what she saw on Adrian Vale's face in that moment was something worse, something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a secret and is almost relieved to be done carrying it. That was the thing that cracked something open in her chest. Not that he'd been lying. She had prepared herself, in the grim arithmetic of sleepless nights, for the lying. What she hadn't prepared for was how tired he looked about it. Like maintaining their marriage had become a burden he'd already quietly decided wasn't worth the wait. "Tell me the truth," she said. "That's all I want from you right now. Just the truth." Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in months, and she watched him search for the version of the truth that would cost him the least. Then she watched him abandon the search. "Yes," he said. "I'm still seeing her." The candles on the counter kept burning. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Boston rain tapped against the window like it had somewhere better to be. Simone placed her water glass down with a care that surprised even her, very slowly, very deliberately, like she was setting down something she had been holding for a long, long time. "Do you love her?" The silence that followed that question was not the silence of a man choosing words. It was the silence of a man who didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty, that honest, terrible, maybe was somehow more devastating than a yes would have been. "I don't know," Adrian finally said. Something inside Simone went absolutely still. Not cold, not numb, still. Like the moment before a decision that cannot be unmade. She looked down at her left hand. At the ring she had worn for 6 years. The ring he had placed on her finger in a garden in Vermont while his voice broke and everyone they loved was watching. The ring that had meant once that she would never have to stand in her own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in her own life. She pulled it off. It slid off easier than she expected. She had been told that pregnancy made your fingers swell, and for a fleeting absurd second she had imagined struggling with it. But it came right off, like it had always known. She crossed the kitchen and placed it in his hand. "Then go back to her," she said. Adrian stared at the ring in his palm. "Simone, I mean it." Her voice didn't waver. Not a tremor. "If you don't know whether you love her, that's your answer. Go find out. But don't come home to me in the meantime." He had expected, she realized. He had expected something she hadn't given him. Screaming, maybe. Bargaining. The crying that might allow him to comfort her, and therefore feel less like the villain of his own story. He wanted her to fall apart, so he could piece her back together and tell himself that meant something. Instead, Simone Avery walked upstairs. She didn't slam anything. She didn't knock anything over. She climbed the stairs of the home they had shared for 4 years, and she sat on the edge of their bed in the dark, one hand on her belly, and she breathed. In and out. For a long time, just that. Their son kicked once. Hard. Like a punctuation mark. "I know," she whispered to him. "I know, baby." She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark for what felt like a long time, and she made a list in her mind, not of grievances, not yet, but of what needed to happen next. Her OB appointment was Thursday. Her blood pressure had been creeping at the last 2 visits, and Dr. Patrice Odom had said, clearly, and without alarm, but without softness either, that stress was not her friend right now. Her hospital bag was half-packed in the closet. Sophie had a counseling appointment on Friday that Adrian would certainly forget. Richard, Adrian's father, had a neurology follow-up next week that Simone had spent 2 evenings preparing notes for, because the previous doctor had seemed rushed, and Richard had trouble tracking information when he was nervous. She thought about all of it. And then, somewhere around 4 in the morning, she got up, pulled 2 suitcases from the top shelf of the closet, and began to pack. She didn't take the jewelry Adrian had given her on birthdays and anniversaries, the pieces that had started to feel, in retrospect, like substitutes for the actual presence of the man she'd married. She didn't touch the joint accounts. She didn't call a lawyer at 4 in the morning or take photographs of anything or do any of the things that the angrier version of herself might have done. She simply packed what was hers. Clothes, books, the small framed photograph from her sister's wedding, which was also her favorite photograph of herself because she looked in it like someone who still knew who she was. Her prenatal vitamins. Miles's first ultrasound photograph, the one where you could see the suggestion of his nose. Before she closed the second suitcase, she sat down at the desk in the corner of their bedroom and spent 40 minutes writing notes she did not have to write. Richard's medications dosage, schedule, the name of the pharmacy on Newbury that knew him. Margaret's cardiologist appointment, the date and the parking situation at the hospital, and the fact that Margaret liked to arrive 15 minutes early because being on time made her anxious. Sophie's Friday session, the name of the therapist, the address, the reminder that Sophie sometimes needed to sit in silence in the car for a few minutes before she could walk in, and that pushing her before she was ready made the sessions worse. She slid the notes into an envelope and left it on the kitchen counter. Then she picked up her hospital bag and her 2 suitcases, and she walked out of that house before the sun came up. She did not cry until she was in the car, 3 blocks away. Then she cried hard, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief, from the place where you have been holding something for so long that your body simply cannot maintain the grip any longer. She let herself have it for exactly as long as it took to reach the highway. Then she wiped her face and drove. Adrian woke at 7:15 to an empty house, not merely empty of Simone. Empty in the particular way that houses are, when the person who makes them function has been removed. The coffee was not made. The particular organized quiet of their mornings. Simone moving through the kitchen, the soft sounds of routine that Adrian had absorbed into background noise and never once noticed was gone. He stood in the kitchen in yesterday's shirt and found the envelope on the counter. He opened it, expecting he didn't know what he expected, something that would make him feel worse than he already felt. But what he found was a stack of handwritten notes, so detailed, so carefully considered, that he had to read them twice before he understood what he was looking at. His first instinct, and this would shame him later, was a kind of relief. He sat with that for a moment, turned it over, examined it. Relief. Because now he didn't have to pretend anymore. Didn't have to maintain the double life that had been quietly eating through him for 8 months. He could have Camille without guilt. He could have the version of himself that Camille saw, the unencumbered one, the successful one who wasn't tied down by pediatric appointments and aging parents and a marriage that had grown heavy with the weight of everything. They'd both stopped saying. He would feel terrible about that relief for a long time. That evening, Camille came to the house with champagne that cost more than Sumsol's rent and a smile that contained everything she had been waiting for. They sat in Simone's kitchen at Simone's Marble Island, and Camille talked about how now things could finally be what they were supposed to be. Adrian watched her talk and felt, for the first time, something he couldn't quite name. Then his phone rang. It was Sophie. She was calling from her school, voice trying very hard to be controlled, asking in a too casual tone whether someone was going to pick her up, and also whether there was food at home because she hadn't had lunch, and it was almost 5 o'clock. Her therapist had tried to call the house, she said, because her Friday appointment confirmation had bounced back, and she just wanted to make sure. Adrian felt the specific sensation of a floor giving way. He told Camille he had to go get his daughter. Camille's smile shifted in a way he filed away without meaning to. He found Sophie standing outside the school, in the cold with her backpack on, a careful blankness on her face that he recognized as the expression she wore when she was working very hard not to need anything from anyone. She climbed into the car without saying much. When he asked her what she wanted for dinner and named 2 restaurants, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite a 16-year-old's expression. "There's usually stuff at home," she said. "Simone usually." She stopped. "Where's Simone?" Sophie asked very quietly. Adrian kept his eyes on the road. "She's staying with a friend for a while." The silence in the car was a specific kind of silence. The kind that 16-year-olds make when they are doing complex emotional mathematics and the answer keeps coming out wrong. "Is she okay?" Sophie asked finally. "She's fine," Adrian said. It was not the worst lie he had told that week, but it landed differently. Because Sophie was not asking whether Simone's body was fine. She was asking something else entirely. And they both knew it. He made them pasta that night badly, the noodles slightly overdone, the sauce from a jar, and they ate together at the kitchen table in a silence that had texture to it. Sophie ate half of what was on her plate and pushed the rest around. Adrian ate too fast because he was uncomfortable. The candles that Simone had lit the night before were still on the counter, burned most of the way down, and nobody blew them out. Before she went to her room, Sophie paused in the kitchen doorway. "Dad," she said. Then she stopped then. "Never mind." "You can say it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were the precise shape of a question he wasn't ready to answer. "Good night," she said instead, and she went upstairs. The cottage Simone rented was small, and it smelled like someone else's lavender soap, and the heat made a noise in the pipes at night that she hadn't gotten used to yet. It had 1 bedroom and a kitchen that faced a backyard full of bare November trees, and it was 40 minutes out since, in a way that felt in a way that felt deliberate, far enough to her key decision to travel, close enough that it wasn't running. She unpacked slowly. She put Miles's ultrasound on the nightstand. She found a spot for her vitamins. She called her OB's after-hours line and left a message explaining there had been a significant life change, and she wanted to make sure her appointment Thursday was still logged. Dr. Ojam's nurse called back within an hour and said, of course, and also gently, that the doctor would want to know about stress levels. "I'm managing," Simone said, which was true, which was also the most careful word she could find. She called her sister, Renata, who was in Atlanta and who said very little and listened very much, which was exactly why Simone had called her and not someone who would tell her what to do. Renata asked only one thing before they hung up. "Do you need me there?" Simone thought about it honestly. "Not yet," she said, "but I'll tell you when." "Okay," Renata said. "I'll have my bag ready." Simone slept that first night better than she had in months, which told her something she had been refusing to name. 2 days later, Sophie showed up at the cottage door. Not a call first. Not a text asking if it was okay. Just Sophie, backpack on, eyes slightly too bright, standing on the small front step with the careful expression of someone who has been rehearsing what they're going to say and abandoned all of it on the drive over. "I took the bus," Sophie said. "I looked up the route." Simone stepped aside and let her in. Sophie sat at the small kitchen table and declined tea twice, and then accepted it on the third offer, and wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it for a long time before she looked up. I knew about her, Sophie said. The sentence dropped into the room like something heavy. Simone didn't move. What do you mean? About Camille. Sophie's voice was very careful and very young and very tired simultaneously. I saw messages on my dad's tablet in September. I wasn't snooping. I was trying to look something up for school, and his tablet was on the couch, and it was unlocked, and she stopped. I read enough, she said, before I could stop myself. Simone sat down across from her. Sophie, I didn't tell you because I thought if you found out, you'd leave. Sophie's voice broke precisely at that point, just fractured, like a thin piece of ice. And I thought if you left, then everything would fall apart. And I kept thinking maybe they would end it on their own, or maybe you already knew and had decided to stay, or she stopped again, pressed her lips together. I told myself a lot of things. Simone looked at this girl, this 16-year-old, who had sat with an adult secret for 2 months, alone, managing it the way she managed everything that frightened her, which was to build walls around it and hope they held, and felt something rise in her that was fiercer than any emotion she had felt in the kitchen 2 nights ago. Look at me, Simone said. Sophie looked up. That was not yours to carry. You understand me? Not 1 ounce of it. You were 16 years old, and you found out something that adults failed to protect you from knowing. And you did the only thing that made sense to you, which was to try to protect the people you loved. That was not your job. It was never your job. Sophie's chin was trembling. You're not leaving because of me, right? She's asked. I mean, you're not. I'm leaving because of your father's choices, Simone said. Quietly, clearly, not yours. You couldn't have stopped this. Me staying wouldn't have fixed it. Do you hear what I'm saying? Sophie nodded. Then she started to cry, really cry. Not the careful, controlled crying she usually allowed herself, but the messy, undignified kind that she clearly needed badly and had probably been holding back since September. Simone moved around the table and sat beside her and put her arm around this girl who was not her daughter, but also not her daughter, and held on. Miles kicked hard enough that Sophie felt it through Simone's side and pulled back in surprise, eyes still wet, and then almost laughed at the absurdity and the tenderness of it. He's impatient, Simone said. Yeah, Sophie said softly. He must take after you. There are things Adrian Vale discovered in the weeks after Simone left that he would not have predicted. Practical things. The kind of things you don't know until the person who knew them is no longer there to know them for you. He discovered, for instance, that Richard's neurologist required the patient to bring a printed medication list to every appointment, not a verbal summary, because the doctor had told someone, presumably Simone, that Richard sometimes minimized his symptoms in conversation, and the paper list kept everyone honest. He discovered this because he drove Richard to the appointment himself for the first time and stood at the intake desk while the nurse asked for the medication list. And Adrian reached for his phone with confidence and came up completely empty. He had not known there was a medication list. He had not known there were 5 medications. He had not known that the tremor in Richard's left hand had been documented at 3 consecutive appointments and was progressing in a way the doctor considered significant. Richard knew all of this because Simone had gone over it with him before every appointment, had sat with him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and walked through what the doctor was likely to ask and helped him practice saying the things he tended to minimize. In the exam room, while the doctor spoke, Adrian watched his father and realized something slow and awful. Richard was not surprised by anything the doctor said, because none of it was new information. It was only new to Adrian. In the parking lot afterward, Richard sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for a moment. And he said without looking at Adrian, she prepared those notes from the beginning, before she ever married you. She asked me questions, what I was afraid of, what I had trouble remembering, what embarrassed me at the doctor. She wrote it all down. She updated it every few months. He paused. She never told you, did she? It was not a question. No, Adrian said. She didn't do it to impress anyone, Richard said. She did it because she is that kind of person. He turned and looked at his son with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but had elements of both. And you, Adrian, I love you. You know I do. But you are the kind of man who can only see the river after the water's gone. Adrian drove home in silence. That night, Camille called twice, and he let it go to voicemail both times. He sat at the kitchen table where the envelope of notes still sat. He hadn't been able to throw it away, and he read through Simone's handwriting again. The small letters. The neat, unhurried detail. The note about Margaret getting anxious before medical tests and liking to arrive early. The note about Sophie's silence in the car. He had lived with this woman for 6 years. He had not known about the silence in the car. He called Simone. She picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice was careful and not unkind. She asked how Richard's appointment had gone. "How did you know I went?" he asked. "Richard texted me," she said. "He does that." He didn't know Richard texted Simone. He didn't know they had that kind of relationship, easy, independent of him, built on a foundation he had never seen being laid. "I didn't know any of it," he said. "The medication list." Adrian, I didn't know what I was missing," he said. "I didn't know it was missing." Simone was quiet for a moment. "Then I know. That's supposed to make it better?" "No," she said. "It just means I believe you." A pause. "It doesn't change anything, though." He wanted to argue. He didn't. Because she was right, and he had just spent the drive home understanding that she was right, and he was tired of looking for the angle from which he was less wrong. "How are you feeling?" he asked. A small silence. "The baby's good. My blood pressure is something Dr. Odom is watching. I'm managing, Simone." "Good night, Adrian," she said. Gently, firmly. "Give Sophie her space this week. She's processing things." She hung up. He sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house around him was enormous and bright, and completely, utterly hollow. Somewhere, Camille's voicemail notifications sat unanswered on his phone. He left them there. The morning after Adrian sat alone in that hollow kitchen, Camille Hartley showed up at the front door without calling first. That was the thing about Camille that Adrian had found exciting for 8 months, and now, standing in his doorway at 9:15 on a Saturday morning with his dead father's coffee mug in his hand, found simply tiring. She didn't call first because she had never needed to. He had always been available to her. He had engineered his life so that he was always, somehow, available to her. She was wearing a coat he recognized because he had been there when she bought it. She was carrying 2 coffees from the place on Dartmouth Street. That's $14 each, and she was $14 each. And she was smiling the smile woman who has decided that the hard part is over. "I thought we could talk," she said, "about the house." Adrian stepped back and let her in because he didn't have the language yet for what he was feeling, and he needed a minute to find it. Camille walked through the foyer and into the living room and looked around with the particular expression of someone taking inventory, not cruelly, just assessing, like she was measuring the space against something she had imagined. "We should probably talk about what makes sense," she said, setting the coffees on the side table. "I mean, it's a big house for one person. Sophie's only here part-time, and once the baby situation is—" "The baby situation," Adrian said. Camille paused, turned, read something in his face that made her recalibrate. "I just meant that the logistics. His name is Miles," Adrian said. "We named him Miles." A small silence moved through the room. "I know that," Camille said carefully. "Do you?" He wasn't being cruel. He was genuinely asking. Because he was standing in his living room with a woman he had blown up his marriage for, and realizing, in the specific clear light of a Saturday morning, without Simone's presence to blur anything, that he was not sure what Camille actually knew about his life, what she had ever wanted to know. Camille picked up one of the coffees, took a sip. "Adrian, I understand you're going through a lot right now. My father has a progressive neurological condition," he said. "Did I ever tell you that?" She looked at him. His left hand tremors. "It's been documented at 3 consecutive appointments. Simone's had notes." He paused. "I didn't know. I lived in this house with Simone for 4 years, and I didn't know because she handled it, and I let her handle it, and I was busy." He stopped. "I was busy with you, Camille, among other things." Camille set the coffee down. "That's not fair." "I'm not trying to be unfair," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what's true. I've been trying to do that for about 48 hours, and it's not going well." He looked at her, really looked at her the way he'd looked at Simone in the kitchen 2 nights ago, and he tried to see clearly. "What did you think this was going to look like? You and me. This house, what did you actually imagine?" "I imagined us," she said. "Like it was simple." "Which version of me?" he asked. "The one who had dinner free 4 nights a week because my wife was home managing everything? Or—" "You're doing this," Camille said, and her voice had an edge now. "You're doing the thing where you make me the reason for every problem." "You're not the reason for every problem," he said. And he meant it. That was the thing, he genuinely meant it. "But I need to figure out what I actually did. And right now I can't do that with you standing in Simone's living room talking about the house." The word Simone's landed in the room, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, and it sat there anyway. Camille picked her coat up from the arm of the chair where she'd draped it. She picked it up slowly, deliberately, with the control of someone who is very angry and has decided not to be visibly very angry. She picked up the second coffee too, the one she had brought for him. "When you figure out what you actually did," she said, "let me know if I'm still part of the answer." She left without slamming the door. Adrian stood in the living room with one coffee and all that quiet and did not feel like he had won anything. Margaret Vale called at 11. She called on the house line, which she always did because she didn't trust cell phones to carry important information correctly, and Adrian answered in the kitchen and held the phone with both hands, because that was a habit from childhood. His mother's calls had always required both hands. "Your father told me about the appointment," she said. No preamble. Margaret Vale had been a school principal for 22 years and had never learned small talk and had never tried. "He said you didn't know about the medication list." "Mom, I'm not calling to punish you, Adrian. I'm calling because I have something to say, and I'd prefer to say it while I still have the nerve." A pause. The particular pause of a 71-year-old woman selecting her words with the care of someone who has learned, over a long time, that words land harder than you intend. "Your father was unfaithful to me. Did you know that?" Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. "No. 33 years ago. Her name was a woman he worked with. It lasted since about a year." Another pause. "I found out the way women usually find out, not because he told me, but because the secret got too large to fit inside the house anymore." Her voice was very even. "I nearly left. I had a bag packed. I had my sister's address written on a piece of paper in my coat pocket." Adrian said nothing because there was nothing to say. He was holding the phone with both hands and staring at the kitchen counter and listening. "We went to counseling for 2 years," Margaret said. "Real counseling. The kind where your father had to sit in a room and say things out loud that he would rather have swallowed. And eventually," she stopped, "eventually we rebuilt something. But I want to be very clear about what it cost and how long it took, and the fact that there were years in between where I did not know whether it was worth it." "Years. I know Simone isn't you," Adrian said. "And I'm not finished," Margaret said, with the calm precision of a woman who has earned the right to finish. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something that your father took years to understand. I stayed. That was my choice. And I will not have you walking around, assuming that Simone will make the same choice, simply because forgiving a man is something women are supposed to do. It is not something anyone is supposed to do. It is something people sometimes choose, at a price, over a very long time. And it is absolutely not something the person who caused the damage gets to put on a schedule." The word schedule went through Adrian like cold water. "She left calmly," he said. Not as a defense. Just as a fact he was still trying to understand. She just left, quietly. She packed, and she left before sunrise, and she left notes about your cardiology appointment, and Dad's medications, and Sophie's counseling session. She left notes, Mom. On the night her marriage ended. A long silence from his mother. "I know," Margaret said quietly. "You knew she left?" She called me. "The morning after." A pause. "She called to make sure I had everything I needed. She asked about my next appointment. She apologized for any worry the situation might cause me." Margaret's voice was not quite steady now. "That's who she is, Adrian. That's who you had." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. "I know," he said. "Good," his mother said. "Then you know what you lost. And you know that it is not something you can buy back with apologies and flowers and sincerity, however genuine your sincerity may eventually become. You earn things back by changing quietly, over a long time, without expecting to be rewarded for it." She paused one last time. "That's the thing your father took the longest to learn. The change is not a payment. The change is just who you should have been." She said goodbye and hung up. Adrian put the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a very long time. Sophie skipped school on Thursday. Not in the way teenagers skip school when they want to do something else. In the way they skip school when they cannot make themselves be in a building full of people who do not know anything is wrong and they do not have the energy to pretend otherwise. Adrian got a call from the school's attendance office at 10:15. He called Sophie's cell phone and she picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been holding it, which she had been waiting for someone to notice. "Where are you?" he asked. "Home," she said. She sounded flat, not defiant, just flat like a tire that's been slow leaking for weeks. "I didn't feel like going." He rearranged 2 meetings and came home. He found her on the couch in the den, in yesterday's clothes, with a blanket over her legs and her phone on her chest, staring at the ceiling in the way that was not the relaxed staring of a person resting, but the fixed staring of a person trying to stay ahead of something. He sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't say anything about school. He didn't say anything about anything for a minute. And the silence was uncomfortable in the specific way that silences are when 2 people are not used to sitting together without a task to organize around them. "Sophie," he said. "I'm fine," she said, automatic. The reflexive fine of someone who has said it so many times, it no longer means anything. "You don't have to be," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. The expression on her face was complicated, in the way that 16-year-olds are complicated when they are deciding how much truth a parent can actually hold. "Simone used to just sit with me," Sophie said, "when I was having a bad day. She didn't ask questions. She would just come in and sit somewhere near me and be there. And after a while I could breathe again." A pause. I don't know how she knew when I needed that. She just knew. Adrian wanted to say something useful. He couldn't locate anything useful. "Your mom does that too," he offered, carefully. Sophie's expression shifted slightly. "Mom is different. Mom worries out loud, which is fine. I love Mom." "But Simone," she stopped. Simone just made it feel like things were going to be okay, without saying that things were going to be okay, because she didn't lie about it being hard. She just made hard feel survivable. The words landed on him with a weight he hadn't expected. "She's still in your life," he said. "She's not leaving you." "I know that," Sophie said. "But it's different now. Everything's different. And I know that's because of what you did." She said it without venom, just stated it the way she would state a fact. The sky was gray. His choices had changed everything. "And I'm not saying I hate you. I don't hate you. But I need you to know that I know. So we stop pretending I don't." Adrian looked at his daughter. She met his eyes steadily. This girl who had been carrying a secret for 2 months because she loved the wrong people to protect. And he thought about how much of her steadiness had been learned and how little of it he had taught her. "I know you know," he said. "And I'm sorry. Not just for the affair. For all of it. For everything you had to carry that wasn't yours." Sophie turned back to the ceiling. "Are you going to try to get her back?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "Good," Sophie said. "Because she's not a prize, Dad. She's a person, and I think she's really tired." Simone's blood pressure spiked on a Tuesday. She was at a small grocery store in the town near the cottage, moving slowly the way you move at 35 weeks when your body has stopped pretending this is comfortable, and she was comparing 2 brands of decaf coffee, with the focus of a woman who has decided that the small decisions are the ones she can still control. And then the edges of her vision went slightly wrong, in a way she didn't have a word for, but recognized immediately as not right. She stood very still in the coffee aisle. Her heart was beating in a way she could feel in her teeth. She put the coffee down. She found the nearest checkout and paid for what was in her basket without really processing what she was buying. She sat in the car in the parking lot and breathed carefully and timed herself and called Dr. Odom's emergency line. Dr. Odom's nurse asked her 3 questions and then said, "Come in now, not later now." Simone drove herself to the hospital because there was no one in that parking lot to drive her, and she was not going to call Adrian, and she was not going to frighten Sophie, and Renata was in Atlanta. And she was 35 weeks pregnant, and the only thing she had complete control over in her life, right now, was remaining calm. So she remained calm. She drove at exactly the speed limit. She parked in the lot closest to the maternity entrance. She checked herself in. She was hooked to a fetal monitor within 10 minutes, and she lay on the exam table in the quiet hum of the machine and listened to Miles's heartbeat, that fast, steady, absolutely reliable sound, and something in her chest unlocked just slightly. He was okay. She focused on that. Dr. Odom came in 20 minutes later with a look on her face that was professional composed, but contained, in the corners, a concern she wasn't fully hiding. "Your BP is 162/98, she said, pulling up the numbers on the tablet. That's not where we want to be. I know, Simone said. Miles looks good. His heart rate is where I want it. You got here fast, which was the right call. Dr. Odom sat in the chair that Chitsedved rather than staying on her feet, which Simone had learned, meant the conversation was going to be real rather than clinical. What happened today? What were you doing? Grocery shopping. Before that, this week. What's the stress level? Simone looked at the ceiling. I left my husband 3 weeks ago. I'm living alone in a rented cottage. I'm 35 weeks pregnant. Dr. Odom was quiet for a moment. I know, you told me at the last visit. A pause. I want to keep you for a few hours. Monitor the BP and the baby. If the numbers come down to a range I'm comfortable with, you go home with instructions. If they don't, she left that end open with the professional precision of someone who doesn't make threats they can't predict. Okay, Simone said. Is there anyone you want me to call? Simone thought about it honestly. I'll call my sister, she said. She's in Atlanta. And the baby's father? Another pause. He should probably know, Simone said. Not warmly. Not coldly. With the flat pragmatism of a woman making a sensible decision she has no particular feeling about. But I'll tell him myself. When there's something useful to tell him. She lay there for 3 hours while the monitor tracked Miles. And nurses came in at intervals to check her pressure. And the number moved, slowly and grudgingly, from 162 down to 147 to 139 to 129. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about the notes she'd left on Adrian's counter. She thought about Richard's appointment that she had not been there for. She thought about Sophie on the bus to the cottage. She thought about the woman she had been before this marriage, before the slow, quiet process of making herself smaller to make space. For everyone else had become so normal, she stopped being able to see it. She thought about a job posting she had seen 2 days ago for a family support coordinator position at a maternal health organization based in Cambridge. She had worked in hospital family services before Adrian. She had been good at it. She had left it gradually, incrementally, in ways that had seemed at the time like practical decisions, because Adrian's life had needed organizing, and she had been the one to organize it, and somehow that had become her primary occupation, without either of them ever naming it out loud. She pulled out her phone. She found the posting. She read it again. Then she screenshot it and set the phone face down on her chest. Miles kicked. I know, she said quietly. I know. We're going to be okay. She was not performing it for anyone. She was saying it to a person who couldn't yet hear her, in a hospital room, alone, with her blood pressure slowly returning to something manageable, and she believed it with the particular quiet certainty of a woman who has already survived the worst thing she was afraid of and found out it didn't finish her. Adrian got the text at 7:40 that evening. Simone had written it in the careful way she wrote everything. Brief, accurate, containing exactly what he needed to know, and nothing extraneous. Blood pressure issue today. I'm at Brigham. They monitored me and Miles for a few hours. Numbers are down. Dr. Odom is happy with the trajectory. Miles is fine. I'm being discharged in the next hour. You don't need to come, everything is being handled. Just wanted you to know. He was already in his car by the third sentence. He drove faster than he should have and arrived at the hospital to find Simone sitting up in the monitoring room in a hospital gown, still attached to one monitor, scrolling through her phone with the focused calm of a woman who has been managing a crisis by herself and has it handled. Her hair was slightly loose from whatever she'd had it in that morning. Her feet were bare. She looked, in the harsh fluorescent light of the room, both utterly exhausted and utterly composed, and when she looked up and saw him in the doorway, her face did something complicated that resolved itself back into neutral. I said you didn't need to come, she said. I know, he stayed in the doorway. Didn't come further in without her permission. He had learned in the last 3 weeks that the distances between them now required permission in ways they hadn't before. I came anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her phone. Miles is fine. My BP is cooperating. Dr. Odom is comfortable with me going home. Home to the cottage, he said. Yes, alone. She looked up again. Adrian, I'm not trying to argue, he said, and he meant it, and something in his voice convinced her of that, because she held his gaze instead of closing the conversation down. I'm just sitting with the fact that you drove yourself to the hospital, that you lay here for 3 hours by yourself, and you texted me an update the way you'd update a colleague. What would you have preferred? She asked, not harshly, genuinely. I'd have preferred, he stopped, ran his hand over his face. I'd have preferred to have been the person you thought of calling. Simone was quiet for a moment. The monitor beside her tracked Miles's heartbeat steadily, that reliable fast rhythm that neither of them could hear without being affected by it. You weren't, she said, simply. And that's not a punishment, Adrian. That's just where we are. That's what happens when trust breaks. I couldn't think of you and feel safe in the same moment. So I handled it the way I handle things. She paused. I'm good at handling things. I know you are, he said. That's part of what He stopped himself. Part of what you what, she asked. He looked at her under those lights, and what came out of his mouth was not planned, and was not polished, and was not the right moment for it, but was true. Part of what I took for granted. Simone, I took it for granted. All of it. You just made everything work. And I walked through my life, and never once. Adrian. Her voice was tired, not cruel, just tired. Please don't do this here. Not in a hospital room. Not while I'm hooked to a monitor. When? He asked. I don't know, she said. I don't know if there's a when, but not now. He nodded. He came into the room then, one step, and he looked at the monitor numbers, and he looked at the column on the left, that was Simone's pressure, and he looked at the column on the right, that was Miles's heart rate, and he stood there, reading them the way you read something you should have been reading all along. Can I get you anything? He asked. Water. Coffee. Anything. She looked at him for a beat. Water, she said. The decaf from the vending machine is terrible, but it's warm. He got both. He sat in the chair beside the bed, that was not beside her bed exactly, but adjacent to it, at a careful distance, and they waited together for the discharge paperwork, and they did not talk much, and what they said was small and practical, and neither of them pretended it was anything else. When the nurse came in with the discharge instructions, the nurse looked between them, and then at Simone and asked, in the professionally neutral tone of someone who asks this question all the time, is someone driving you home? Simone opened her mouth. I am, Adrian said. Simone closed her mouth, looked at him. Something moved across her face that was neither forgiveness nor permission, but was maybe something smaller and more honest than either something like, fine, just this once, just for tonight. Fine, she said, just to the cottage. Just to the cottage, he agreed. They drove in near silence, through the Boston night, rain beginning again against the windshield, and Adrian kept both hands on the wheel and didn't say anything he couldn't take back. And Simone sat with her hand on her belly, and Simone sat with her hand on her belly and looked out the window at the city moving past, and Miles's heartbeat was somewhere between them, not something they could hear, but something they were both aware of, steady and insistent, and completely indifferent to the mess they had made of everything around him. Adrian pulled up to the cottage and kept the engine running. Simone reached for the door handle. Then she stopped. Adrian, she said. She was still looking through the windshield at the cottage, at the small lighted window. When Sophie told me she'd known about Camille for 2 months, since September, a pause. Did you know she knew? No, he said, immediately. I had no idea. Simone nodded slowly. A 16-year-old girl carried that secret for 2 months, because she thought telling the truth would cost her the only stable thing in her life. She turned and looked at him then, directly. That's the blast radius, Adrian. Not just you and me. Sophie. Your parents. The baby who's going to grow up watching how you treat the people who... She stopped herself. That's all I'm going to say. She got out of the car. She walked to the cottage door and let herself in. The light came on in the window. Adrian sat in the idling car in the rain for a long time, his hands still on the wheel, and thought about the word blast radius, and thought about Sophie with her hands around a mug at Simone's kitchen table, and thought about Richard in the car outside the neurologist's office saying you can only see the river after the water's gone, and the thing that had been slowly assembling in itself in his chest over the last 3 weeks finally assembled completely and became something he couldn't compartmentalize anymore. He had not had an affair. He had detonated a bomb in the middle of a life that several people depended on and then been surprised by the damage. He sat in the rain and let that be true without flinching away from it. Then his phone rang. It was Camille. He looked at her name on the screen for a long time. He pressed decline. She called again. He turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and put the car in drive and drove home through the rain. And the whole way back he did not turn the phone over once. And when he got to the house and went inside and sat at the kitchen table, The phone buzzed 3 more times on the counter, and he did not check it. And sometime around midnight, he picked it up and typed a message to Camille that was 11 words long and the most honest thing he had written in a year. I can't keep doing this, I'm sorry, it's over. He set the phone down. He was not sure he had done the right thing, for the right reasons. He was not sure his reasons were clean, or his motives were pure, or that this decision was not still, on some subterranean level, a chess move in a game he was playing to get Simone back. But it was done. And Camille's response came within 3 minutes, furious, sharp, full of the particular scorched earth energy of a woman who had rearranged her expectations around a man who was now retracting, and he read it once and put the phone in a drawer. He sat in the kitchen. He pulled Simone's envelope of notes toward him across the table. He read them again, all of them, every detail. Richard's tremor, Margaret's anxiety before tests, Sophie's silence in the car, Miles's due date. The note Simone had written in parentheses at the bottom of the page about Miles's hospital bag being pre-packed in the cottage closet in case anything happened early, which it had, tonight, almost, and the bag was there, waiting, because Simone had thought of it before she left and packed it and written it down so that no one would have to scramble when the time came. She had thought of the bag. On the night her marriage ended, she had thought of the bag. Adrian put his head in his hands, and for the first time since Simone had walked out of this house, he cried not the performative tears of a man trying to feel sorry enough to feel forgiven, but the ugly, ungoverned crying of someone who has finally looked directly at what he is, and found it much less than what he had believed. It lasted a while. When it was done, he washed his face and went to bed. Did not sleep for a long time. But in the morning, for the first time in 8 months, he woke up without any secret to protect. He woke up without a secret and discovered that was its own kind of weight. The first week after ending things with Camille was not what Adrian had expected. He had expected, on some level, to feel cleaner, lighter, like a man who had stopped lying and was, therefore, on the right side of something. Instead, he woke each morning into the same house, the same hollow rooms, the same coffee he made badly, because he had never learned to make it, the way Simone did, not from a recipe, but from paying attention to the specific person who was going to drink it, and he carried the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped running and now has to stand still and look at what he ran from. He sent flowers to Simone on a Tuesday. White roses, because white roses had always been her preference, a detail he had stored somewhere useful enough to retrieve, apparently, but not useful enough to have acted on when it mattered. Simone's response came 2 hours later, in a text that was 4 words, "Please don't do this." He sent jewelry 3 days after that. A bracelet from a jeweler on Newbury Street that cost what some people paid in rent, one's inside a box that he had sent it an embarrassing amount of time selecting because he wanted the box itself to communicate something about his intentions. And he wrote a card that he rewrote 4 times before settling on a version that felt true rather than strategic. The box came back unopened, no note, no text. Just the box, returned via the same courier, sealed exactly as he had sent it. He stood in his foyer holding the returned box and understood that she was not being cruel. Simone was not built for cruelty. What she was being was clear, and clarity from Simone had always been worth more than anything she could have said in anger, and what this clarity said was, "I am not a problem you can solve with the right purchase." He knew that. He had known it when he sent them. He had sent them anyway, because doing something felt better than doing nothing, and he had not yet learned the difference between action and noise. He put the box in the back of the hall closet and didn't look at it again. He showed up at Simone's cottage on a Thursday morning without gifts. He had called ahead, which was new. He had said, "I need to talk to you. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. I just need to say some things and I'd like you to hear them." She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Thursday morning." Before 10, he arrived at 9:45. She answered the door in a gray sweater that was clearly comfortable rather than presentable, and her hair pulled back, and no effort made toward anything. And she looked, in the flat October light of the cottage doorway, like a woman who had been sleeping better than him and eating actual meals, and had, in some fundamental way, begun the process of being all right. He found that both relieving and devastating in equal measure. She let him in. She had made tea for herself There was one mug, and she sat at the small kitchen table and gestured toward the chair across from her, and he sat in it, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The affair is over, he said. I ended it 3 weeks ago. I know, she said. He looked at her. How? Camille called me, Simone said. Very evenly. The air in the room changed. She called you, he repeated. 3 days after you ended it. Simone wrapped her hands around her mug. She wanted me to know that she wasn't going to disappear quietly. Those were her words. She said she'd spent 8 months being someone's secret, and she wasn't going to. Simone stopped, chose her next words carefully. She had things she wanted to say. Adrian's jaw was tight. What did she say? Does it matter? Yes, he said, it matters. Simone looked at him across the table. She said you told her I was difficult, that the pregnancy had changed me, that you hadn't been happy in the marriage for a long time. She said it without flinching, without making it a weapon, just stated it, the way you state a thing that has already been absorbed. She said you described our marriage as something you'd been trying to find a way out of for years. The silence that followed was the most damning silence Adrian had ever sat inside. Simone, I'm not asking you to defend it, she said. I'm telling you what she said because you asked. I said those things, he said. And then, with the specific difficulty of a man dismantling his own defense in real time, I said them because I was justifying myself to someone who needed me to justify myself. I was making the story work. The story where I wasn't the villain, where the marriage was already broken and I was just. He stopped. I was constructing a version of events where I was more sympathetic. Simone nodded slowly. I know, that's not an excuse. I know that too, she said. But Adrian, she looked down at her mug for a moment. I spent 6 months wondering whether you were right, whether I had become someone who was difficult to love, whether the pregnancy had made me smaller somehow, or needier, or less whatever you needed me to be. She looked up. I spent 6 months questioning every instinct I had, because the man who was supposed to be my partner was quietly telling another woman that I was the problem. He couldn't look at her directly. He tried and couldn't. You were never the problem, he said. I know that now, she said. But you should know what it cost me to get there. He looked at his hands on the table. What can I do? He asked. Tell me what I can actually do. Go to therapy, Simone said immediately. Not to fix us. To understand yourself. Because I don't think you actually know why you did this. And until you do, the apologies are just.
She searched for the word.
They're just weather. They come and they go. I'll go, he said. I'll go tomorrow. Good, she said. We can do co-parenting counseling when Miles arrives. I'd like us to be able to be in a room together, without it costing Miles something. Co-parenting counseling, he said slowly, as though working out what those words contained. Not marriage counseling, she said, clearly, without apology. I'm not there, Adrian. I don't know if I'll ever be there. And I'd rather be honest about that than let you organize your entire recovery around a destination I can't promise you. He nodded. He nodded again. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Yes. When you left the notes you left. Richard's medications, Margaret's appointments, Sophie's session. Why did you do that? On that night of all nights. Why? Simone was quiet for a long moment. Because they're not you, she said finally. I left you. I didn't leave them. And they needed those things regardless of what happened between us. She paused. Richard didn't cheat on me. Margaret didn't. Sophie didn't. She looked at him steadily. You don't stop caring about people because someone else failed you. Adrian looked at his wife, his separated wife, the woman who had walked out of his house at 4 a.m. with 2 suitcases and still found the presence of mind to write notes about his father's medications, and felt something move through him that was beyond shame, beyond regret, that had no clean name, but felt in his chest, like the specific sensation of understanding something too late. I need to become a different person, he said. Yes, she agreed. But not for me. She met his eyes. Become him because Miles is going to need someone steady. Become him because Sophie has already learned too much about what it looks like when love isn't trustworthy. Become him because your father is sick and your mother is tired and they need their son. She paused. Not because you think it's a payment that eventually comes back to you. The sentence hit him like something structural collapsing. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, How do I know if I'm changing for the right reasons? Simone's almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. The expression of a woman who has been asked a real question by a man who is finally asking real questions. You probably won't know for a while, she said. That's part of it. He left the cottage at 10:15. He had a therapy appointment scheduled before he reached the highway. The therapist's name was Dr. Wendell Okafor, and he was not what Adrian had expected. Adrian had expected someone who would listen with careful neutrality and offer frameworks, to perhaps eventually, gently, explain Adrian's childhood to him in ways that would make his behavior feel explicable without making it feel smooth. That was the version of therapy Adrian had imagined, organized, clinical, a transaction between a problem and its professional solution. Dr. Okafor was not particularly interested in being what Adrian had imagined. In the first session, he asked Adrian what he wanted from therapy, and Adrian said he wanted to understand why he had done what he had done. And Dr. Okafor nodded and said, "And what do you think you'll do with that understanding once you have it?" Adrian said he would use it to become someone his children could rely on. Dr. Okafor said, "Is that all?" Adrian said, "And to potentially earn back my wife's trust." Dr. Okafor said, "And if she never offers it?" Adrian didn't have an answer for that. Dr. Okafor said they'd keep coming back to that question. By the third session, Adrian had come to understand that the question was not a test with the right answers. It was a mirror that Dr. Okafor kept holding up at different angles, and what Adrian saw in it shifted slightly each time. And none of the shifts were comfortable, and all of them were necessary. He was starting to understand, sitting in that office twice a week, that the affair had not been about Camille. Not really. It had been about a version of himself, the version that existed, before a mortgage and aging parents, and a pregnant wife, and a stepdaughter, with panic attacks, and a job that had stopped feeling like ambition and started feeling like maintenance. Camille had offered him a reflection he liked better, and he had chosen the reflection over the reality for 8 months, and the reality had kept running without him. Run by a woman who never once let her exhaustion be his problem. He said this to Dr. Okafor in the fourth session. "Doctor," Okafor said, "what do you think that cost her?" Adrian said, "Everything she didn't say." Dr. Okafor said, "And what did her silence cost you?" Adrian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It cost me knowing what I had." The test came on a Wednesday evening in November. Adrian had an $80 million client dinner at a restaurant in the financial district that had been scheduled for 6 weeks, with a client named Harlan Beck, who was 72 years old and had the patience of a man who knew his money made him worth waiting for, and absolutely no one in his life had ever convinced him otherwise. The dinner was not optional in any professional sense. His managing partner had made this clear in 3 separate conversations. Sophie's counseling appointment was at 5:30, across town, with Dr. Margot Keene, who had seen Sophie every 2 weeks for 8 months, and had told Adrian, when he had called to introduce himself as the parent who would now be managing the scheduling, that consistency of attendance was not a preference, but a clinical requirement for the work they were doing. The dinner and the appointment overlapped by 40 minutes on the front end, which meant Adrian could get Sophie to the appointment and miss the first portion of the dinner, or he could get Sophie to the appointment and have his assistant reschedule with Beck's people, or he could not take Sophie to the appointment and take the dinner. He called his managing partner at 4 o'clock. "I have a family obligation," he said. "I need to push the Beck dinner." The silence on the other end of the phone was the silence of a man doing calculations. "Adrian, I know what it is," Adrian said. "I'm asking you to push it." Another silence. "Beck is not going to love this." "I know. Can you handle it?" A long pause. "I'll handle it." "But Adrian, this is the second time this month that—" "I know," Adrian said. "I'll explain when I see you." "Can you handle the call to Beck?" His managing partner said yes, in the tone of a man updating his internal file on Adrian Vale, and they hung up, and Adrian sat in his office for a moment with his hand still on the phone. Then he got up and drove across town. Sophie was already in the waiting room when he arrived, sitting with her backpack between her feet, scrolling her phone. She looked up when he came in, and something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, but the expression of a person recalibrating an expectation they had been careful to keep low. "I thought you had a dinner," she said. "I moved it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her phone. Okay," she said. "Just okay." He sat in the waiting room for 55 minutes while Sophie was inside with Dr. Keene, and he answered emails on his phone, and he did not perform the waiting for anyone. There was no one to perform it for. And when Sophie came out, she looked slightly wrung out. and slightly lighter simultaneously, the way she always looked after the honest sessions. In the car, she was quiet for the first few minutes. He did what Simone had described. He sat with it. He didn't push. He let the silence be what it needed to be. After about 8 minutes, she said, "She wants to talk about the panic attacks." "Okay," he said. "She thinks they're getting worse." He kept his eyes on the road. "What does she think is driving them?" Sophie was quiet. "Then she thinks I have this belief. That when I become too much, too angry or too scared or too difficult, people I love leave." A pause. She called it an abandonment schema. The words landed in the car and sat there. "Sophie, I'm not saying it to make you feel bad," Sophie said, quickly. "I'm saying it because she says I should practice saying it to safe people." She stopped. "You're trying. I can see that you're trying." He pulled into the driveway of the house and put the car in park and sat there. "I'm going to keep showing up," he said. "Not because I want credit for it, because you need me to, and because you never should have had to wonder whether you were worth showing up for." Sophie didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and nodded in a very controlled way that told him she was working hard not to, and he respected the work. "Can we get food?" she said. "I'm starving." "Yeah," he said. "We can get food." They went to a diner 3 blocks from the house, not a restaurant, not anywhere that required a reservation or a jacket, and they ordered eggs at 7 in the evening, the way people do when the day has been long enough that breakfast feels like the most honest option. Sophie ate all of hers. He ate most of his. They talked about her history project and a friend situation that he had no context for, and that she explained with the particular patience of a teenager who has decided to let an adult be part of her life on a trial basis. It was one of the better evenings of his recent memory. He drove home afterward and stood in the kitchen and opened his laptop and found in the downloads folder a folder labeled Family Simone that he had never opened because she had organized it, and he had always assumed he would find things when he needed them, and she would tell him where they were. He opened it. The folder was 47 files. He opened the first one. It took him 4 hours to get through all 47. There were insurance records by family member with renewal dates flagged in bold. There were medical histories, not just facts, but narratives. Sophie's anxiety timeline, with dates of first symptoms, descriptions of what helped and what didn't, names of previous therapists, and brief assessments of what each one had offered. Richard's neurological history going back 6 years, including a note Simone had written to herself that said, "Richard minimizes in front of doctors. Don't let him answer questions alone. Bring printed list. Ask about the falls directly, he won't volunteer this." There was a document simply titled Margaret that was 12 pages long and covered her cardiac history, her medication sensitivities, her preferences around medical appointments, a list of the questions she had about her condition that she was too proud to ask doctors directly, and a section at the bottom labeled What Margaret Won't Say But Needs, which included items like, she needs to be told the appointment went well before leaving the building, or she'll spiral, and she likes the blue waiting room chairs better than the orange ones but won't ask to move. Adrian sat in the dark at his kitchen table and read the document about his own mother, that his wife had written this private, meticulous, loving account of a woman's fears and needs and dignities, and he thought about all the times he had dropped his mother off at appointments and trusted that things had gone fine, because no one called him, and he understood now that things had gone fine, because Simone was managing fine, because Simone had 12 pages of notes about what his mother wouldn't say but needed. There was a folder inside the folder labeled Measles. He opened it. It contained a document titled Before He Arrives that was 17 items long. Hospital bag checklist, Dr. Odom's emergency line, the address of the nearest hospital to the cottage with a note about which entrance was fastest for labor and delivery, a list of items Miles would need in the first month, organized by category, notes on Simone's birth preferences, a note that said, Adrian needs to know Simone's blood type is a negative. This matters if there's blood loss. Make sure someone tells the medical team immediately. She had written a note reminding whoever found the document to make sure medical staff knew her blood type. In a document she had created in the event that something went wrong and he needed to be able to act without her. She had prepared for the possibility that she might not be conscious. She had prepared for it alone, in the cottage, and filed it in a folder where he would eventually find it. He sat at the kitchen table at 1:15 in the morning with both hands flat on the desk, and the thing that happened inside him then was not grief exactly, not guilt exactly, but some combination of the two that was larger than either label, that took up all the available space in his chest and pressed against the inside of his ribs and had nowhere to go. He had spent 8 months talking to Camille about being understood. His wife had spent 6 years, quietly, understanding every person he loved. He picked up his phone. He did not call Simone. It was 1:15 in the morning. She was 36 weeks pregnant, and he had exactly enough self-awareness to know that calling her right now was about his need, not hers. He put the phone back down. He opened a new document on his laptop. He started writing. Not to Simone. Not to anyone. Just writing. The things he had never said, because saying them had always felt like more exposure than he was willing to offer. The specific shape of what he had destroyed. The specific weight of what he had let someone else carry for 6 years, while he moved through his life in the comfortable delusion of a man who believed ease was something he had earned rather than something. Someone else was manufacturing for him every single day. He wrote for 2 hours. He saved it. He would never send it to anyone. But in the morning, he printed it and took it to Dr. Okafor and read it out loud in the session, and that was the closest he had come, in his adult life, to being fully seen by another person. Dr. Okafor said very little when he finished. Then he said, "Do you know what the difference is between remorse and regret?" Adrian said he didn't. Dr. Okafor said, "Regret is about what you lost. Remorse is about what you cost someone else. One turns inward. The other turns outward. Both are necessary. But they are not the same thing." Adrian drove home from that session differently than he had driven to it. Camille Hartley came back, not the way she had come the first time, with champagne and the assumption of welcome. She came back on a gray Friday morning, and she didn't ring the bell. She stood on the front step and called his cell phone, and when he answered, she said, "I'm outside. I just need 5 minutes." He almost said no. He said fine. She looked different than she had the last time he had seen her. Not worse. Camille had never in her life looked worse. She was too precisely maintained for that, but different in a way that took him a moment to identify. And what he identified was that she looked someone who was not performing for anyone, which was not an expression he had often seen on her face. "I said things to Simone that I shouldn't have," she said, standing on the step, not coming inside, like she knew she didn't have that permission anymore. "When I called her, I was angry and I said them to hurt her, and I knew they would, and I did it anyway." Adrian looked at her. "Okay," he said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I'm not trying to—" She stopped. Press her lips together. "I wanted to tell you because she didn't deserve that. And I'm aware that I am probably not the person she needs an apology from most urgently. But I wanted you to know because you should know what kind of another stop, what kind of situation you put all three of us in." "I know what kind of situation I put everyone in," he said. She looked at him. For a long moment, just looked at him, with the expression of a woman assembling a final assessment. "I didn't know about Sophie," she said quietly. "I didn't know how much of I thought your family life was manageable. I thought you had it handled. I didn't know that Simone was the reason it looked handled." She paused. "I didn't want to know. I think that's more honest." He said nothing. "I hope she's okay," Camille said. "The pregnancy." "I mean that. She's managing," he said. Camille nodded. She looked at the step for a moment. Then she looked back up at him. "For whatever it's worth, she's not what you described. When you talked about her, she's not what you made her sound like." A pause. "You were wrong about her. You were very, very wrong about her. And I think somewhere you knew it and said those things anyway. And I think that's the part you probably need to sit with." She left, without waiting for him to respond. He closed the door. He stood in the foyer for a long time. Camille had just said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 8 months, and she had said it on her way out. He thought about calling Simone to tell her about the visit. He decided against it. It felt like offering information that might look like a point in his favor, and he was trying, slowly and imperfectly, to stop organizing his good behavior around the scoreboard. He went upstairs. He went into the room that had been prepared as a nursery. Simone had started it before she left. The crib assembled, the walls painted a soft gray, the small bookshelf with the books she had selected one by one, and he stood in the doorway and looked at it. Miles was going to live in this house part-time. Miles was going to grow up watching how his father treated the people around him. He was going to form his first understanding of what men were from watching Adrian. That thought had been sitting at the edge of Adrian's awareness for weeks, and he had been keeping it at the edge, keeping it peripheral, because looking at it directly required a level of accountability he was still learning to tolerate. But standing in the doorway of that gray room with the small bookshelf and the crib Simone had assembled while she was still living in this house, he let it move to the center. His son was coming. His son was going to watch everything. And Simone, 36 weeks pregnant, living alone in a rented cottage 40 minutes outside Boston, applying for jobs, rebuilding her life with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, was going to be the primary example Miles had of what strength actually looked like. Adrian had one job: to be worthy of being the other example. He was not there yet. He knew he was not there yet. He could feel the distance between who he was and who he needed to be. And unlike 3 months ago, the distance no longer felt like something he could close with the right gesture, or the right apology, or the right grand reckoning in the right moment. It felt like work. Long, unglamorous, unwitnessed work. He went downstairs. He called Margaret to check on her cardiology appointment, without anyone reminding him. She picked up on the second ring, sounding slightly surprised. "I was just thinking about calling you," she said. "How'd the appointment go?" he asked. A small pause. Then, carefully, it went well. Dr. Soren was pleased with the numbers. Another pause. "Your father drove me." "Good," he said. She stopped. "Yes," he said. "You sound different," she said. He looked around the kitchen, at the counter where the envelope of notes had sat, at the table where he had read Simone's files for 4 hours in the dark, at the refrigerator door where he had, 2 days ago, for the first time in his adult life, written Richard's appointment on the calendar himself so he would not need someone to remind him. "I'm trying to be," he said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's enough for now. That's really all I needed to hear." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen. It was 12:30 on a Friday afternoon, and somewhere across the city, Simone Avery was building her life, back from the pieces he had scattered, and somewhere in that life a boy named Miles was getting ready, in his own time, to arrive. And Adrian Vale stood alone in his kitchen, with absolutely no guarantee that any of the changes he was making would be rewarded. No promise from anyone that the work would come back to him in any form he recognized. And he stood there with that uncertainty and did not reach for his phone to call anyone who would make it feel smaller than it was. He let it be exactly as large as it was. Then he started dinner, not from a jar this time. He found a recipe, something simple, something his hands could manage, and he pulled things from the refrigerator, and he made something from scratch in the kitchen of a house that had once run so smoothly. He had never once wondered why, and it wasn't effortless, and it wasn't quiet, and the first attempt burned on the bottom in a way that required starting over. But he started over, and when Sophie came home at 6 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like something real had happened in it. Sophie stopped in the doorway. She looked at the stove. She looked at him. "Did you cook?" she asked. "I tried," he said. "Sit down." She sat down, still wearing her backpack, with the expression of someone managing a cautious hope. He put a plate in front of her. She took a bite, she said, with exactly the same careful diplomacy that Simone would have used in the same moment, and he felt the echo of that, and it was both painful and clarifying. "Yeah," he said, sitting across from her. "I know. I'm working on it." They ate together in a kitchen that was still learning what it was without Simone in it, and outside the window the Boston evening came down gray and cold, and somewhere in a cottage 40 minutes away, a woman he had failed was making plans that had only her name on them, and the phone on Adrian's counter stayed face up and silent, because for the first time in nearly a year, he had nothing to hide. The contraction started at 2:14 in the morning on a Thursday in December. Simone knew immediately that these were not the practice runs, the tightening across her abdomen that had come and gone for the past 2 weeks in the particular way of a body rehearsing, something it wasn't ready to perform yet. These were different. These had weight. These had direction. Each one moved through her like something tidal, like her body had made a decision without consulting the rest of her, and she lay in the dark of the cottage bedroom for exactly 4 minutes between the first and the second one, before she sat up and turned on the light. 36 weeks. 4 weeks early. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through the second one, with her hands pressed flat on her thighs, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and her mind doing the specific arithmetic of a woman who has been preparing for this and is now inside it. When it passed, she reached for her phone on the nightstand. She called Dr. Odom's emergency line. The answering service picked up, and she gave her name and her gestational age, and the interval between contractions 4 minutes, and her voice was level. And the service said Dr. Odom would call back within 10 minutes. She used the 10 minutes to get dressed, not quickly, carefully. She moved through the bedroom with the particular focus of a woman who understands that panic is a luxury she cannot afford right now. Socks first, then the loose pants, then the sweater she had set aside 2 weeks ago because it was comfortable, and she had told herself, setting it aside, that she was being practical, not superstitious. She pulled it on and smoothed it down over Miles and talked to him the way she had been talking to him for weeks, quietly, matter-of-factly, like he was a person she was catching up to speed. "Okay," she said, earlier than planned. "That's okay. We've handled worse." Dr. Odom called back at 2:23. 4 minutes apart, she told the doctor. Getting stronger. Her water hadn't broken, but the pressure was significant, and the pain was not the manageable kind. Dr. Odom said, "Come in now. Don't drive yourself. Is there someone who can bring you?" Simone thought about this for exactly 2 seconds. She called Renata first. Renata was in Atlanta, and it was 2 in the morning, and the phone rang 4 times before her sister picked up with the blurred voice of someone coming out of deep sleep. And when Simone said it's time, send, Renata was awake instantly, in the way that only the people who really love you can be. "I'm getting on a flight," Renata said. "You won't make it in time," Simone said. "But come anyway." Then she called Adrian. His phone was on the nightstand, and he was a light sleeper now, in a way he hadn't been before. Another thing that had changed in the last 2 months. This new alertness, this sense of being on call for his own life, and he grabbed it before the second ring. Simone's name on the screen at 2:25 in the morning. He was already sitting up before he answered. "It's time," she said. Her voice was steady, completely, almost unnervingly steady. "The contractions are 4 minutes apart. I need someone to drive me to Brigham." He was already standing. "I'm coming." Adrian's Simone. He was pulling on clothes one-handed, phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear, moving with a speed that had nothing performed in it. No audience, no gesture, just a man trying to close the distance between himself and the person who needed him. "I am getting in the car right now. I'll be there in 35 minutes. A pause, then okay, he made it in 28. He had not gone 28 minutes from his house to the cottage in the history of their entire marriage. He drove through empty Boston streets at an hour when the city was as close to quiet as it ever got, and he did not think about anything except the road and the distance, and the number 4 minutes between contractions, 4 minutes, and the one thing Dr. Okafor had said in their last session that was sitting in his chest right now, like something lit. "When it counts, you show up. That's the only evidence that matters." He showed up. Simone was standing on the small front step of the cottage when he pulled up, hospital bag at her feet, one hand on the doorframe, and the sight of her there 36 weeks pregnant, standing in the December cold, having gotten herself ready and gotten her bag and gotten to the door all by herself, because that was simply what she did, hit him somewhere in the sternum. That was not a place he had good language for. He got out of the car and took the bag from her without asking permission, and she let him take it without saying anything, and he opened the passenger door, and she got in slowly, and when she was settled, he closed the door and got back in and pulled onto the road, and they drove. "How far apart?" he asked. 3.5 minutes, maybe, she said. Her voice had a tight edge now that it hadn't had on the phone, not panic, just effort, the voice of someone managing physical pain with considerable concentration. "They're closer." "You're doing great," he said. "Don't," she said. "Okay," he said. They drove. He didn't turn the radio on. He didn't fill the silence with anything. He drove and she breathed, and when a contraction came, he could tell because her right hand went flat against the dashboard, and her breath changed. He didn't say anything, and he didn't look over more than once to check, and he kept driving at exactly the speed that was fast enough to matter and controlled enough to be safe. When they turned onto Francis Street, and the hospital came into view, she exhaled one long, slow exhale, and he felt it in the car like something releasing. "Adrian," she said. "Yeah." Thank you for coming fast. He pulled up to the labor and delivery entrance. He put the car in park. He turned and looked at her. There's nowhere else I would be, he said. She looked at him. Her face was tired and tight with pain and stripped of every social grace. Pain does that. It removes everything unnecessary. And what was left was just Simone, just the actual woman, without performance or management or the careful neutrality she had been maintaining for 2 months. And she looked at him, and something moved in her eyes that was not forgiveness, but was not nothing either. Then another contraction hit, and she gripped the dashboard again. Inside, she said through her teeth. He got her inside. The labor and delivery floor at Brigham at 2:50 in the morning had its own particular atmosphere, not quiet exactly, but purposeful. The controlled intensity of a place that does significant things on a schedule determined by nobody. Nurses moved with the unhurried speed of people who have done this 10,000 times and understand that urgency and panic are different things, and only one of them helps. They got Simone into a room and onto a monitor, and the first thing the fetal monitor told them was that Miles's heart rate was where it should be, and Simone closed her eyes briefly when she heard it that fast. Steady rhythm, and Adrian stood at the edge of the room and did not move further in than the door without permission. A nurse named Delia, who had the manner of a woman who has watched enough frightened men in labor rooms to have developed a very accurate read on them, looked at Adrian and said, "Relationship?" "Father," he said, where he glanced at Simone. Separated. Simone, eyes still closed, said, "He can stay." Delia looked between them with the professional neutrality of someone who has seen every configuration of people in this situation. "Okay," she said, and moved on to the blood pressure cuff. The numbers on the cuff made Delia's face do something careful and controlled. She went out and came back with a second nurse and then doctor. Odom arrived 20 minutes later, still in the coat she had pulled on over what looked like pajamas, which was somehow the most reassuring thing Adrian had seen all night. A doctor who came in the middle of the night, in the clothes she was already wearing, because the patient mattered more than the presentation. Dr. Odom checked the monitor, checked Simone's pressure, examined her. Then she stood at the side of the bed and spoke to Simone directly, not to Adrian, not to the room, to Simone. "Your pressure is elevated again," she said. 158/94. "Not in crisis territory, but it's moving in the wrong direction, and I want to be ahead of it. Miles is doing well right now. We're going to watch both of you closely. If the pressure spikes or if Miles shows any distress, we'll talk about intervention." She paused. "How are you feeling?" "Like I want him out," Simone said flatly. Dr. Odom almost smiled. "That's appropriate," she said. "You're at 6 centimeters. You've been working hard." "I've been working hard for 36 weeks, Simone said. "I know," Dr. Odom said. And the way she said it, not clinically, not as a figure of speech, told Adrian that these two women had had conversations he had not been part of, during appointments he had not attended, in which Simone had said true things to someone who could hold them. Margaret and Sophie arrived at 4:15. Adrian had called Margaret from the waiting area while Simone was being settled. Because Margaret was on Simone's emergency contact list, he knew this, from the files, and because it was the right thing to do regardless of any other calculation. Margaret had said she and Richard would come, and Adrian had said Richard should stay home. It was the middle of the night, and Margaret had said she would tell Rich that herself, and had hung up before he could respond. They came without Richard. Sophie walked into the waiting area, still in her school sweatshirt, and the sweatpants she slept in, hair unbrushed, and when she saw Adrian, she stopped and assessed him the way she always did. Now reading the situation, deciding how much to invest, and whatever she read seemed to satisfy her, because she crossed the room and sat next to him without preamble. "How far along?" she asked. 7 centimeters when I last heard," he said. 40 minutes ago. Is she okay?" "Blood pressure's high. They're watching it." Sophie nodded. Her hands were in the front pocket of the sweatshirt, and she was sitting very straight, and her jaw was set in the precise way that meant she was frightened and managing it. He put his hand over her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Margaret sat on his other side and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication from a woman who always had something to say. She had brought her good coat and her good handbag, because Margaret Vale did not go to hospitals unprepared, but her hair wasn't quite right, and her coat had one button misaligned, which told Adrian she had moved faster than often she wanted to let on. He fixed the button without saying anything. She looked down at it and then looked straight ahead. "Thank you," she said quietly. They waited. The waiting was its own kind of difficulty. The labor and delivery floor offered them a small family waiting area with chairs that had clearly been selected by someone who had never sat in them for hours while frightened. And the overhead light was bright enough to feel aggressive. And time moved. The way time moves in hospitals, not in minutes, but in the intervals between information, between the nurse who came out at 4:40 to say things were progressing, and Miles was doing well, and the shift change at 5 that briefly made it unclear who was managing what, and the long stretch between 5:15 and 6 that had no update and required everyone to simply sit inside their own uncertainty and not make it anyone else's problem. Sophie fell asleep somewhere around 5:30, sideways in the chair with her legs over the armrest and her head against the wall, and Adrian watched her sleep with the specific tenderness of a man who has only recently understood what gift he's been given in this particular person's trust. Then the monitor alarm went off. He didn't hear it directly. The labor rooms were down a corridor and through 2 sets of doors, but he knew something had changed because 2 nurses moved past the waiting area at a speed that was faster than the speed things had been moving at, and then a third, and then a fourth, and Adrian was on his feet before he understood why. Margaret put her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. "Mom, wait," she said again, firmly. "Let them work." He stood at the entrance to the corridors. He could see, through the small window in the first set of doors, movement. More movement than there had been, the kind of organized urgency that hospitals generate around problems they are equipped to handle, but that require immediate action to stay that way. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Delia." Miles's heart rate dropped. "They're stabilizing. Simone asked me to tell you, so you didn't imagine something worse. She's okay. He's okay. Stay in the waiting room." He read it 3 times. He went back to the waiting room. He sat down. He put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face, and he breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, the way Dr. Okafor had taught him when he described the specific sensation of being unable to locate himself under pressure. And Margaret sat beside him and put her hand on his back and didn't say anything, and he was grateful for that, for the not saying, for the simple weight of her hand. Sophie woke up. She looked at his posture and understood immediately. "What happened?" "Miles's heart rate dropped," he said. "They're handling it. Delia says they're both okay." Sophie's face went through several expressions quickly. Then she pulled her knees to her chest in the chair and said, "Okay." "Okay," they said. "Okay." They said, "Okay," he confirmed. They sat together in the yellow light of the waiting room, a man who had burned his family down and was slowly learning to build from the ash. A woman in her 70s who had survived her own version of this and found a way through that cost her but held. And a 16-year-old girl who had been asked to carry too much too young and was, despite everything, still here, and they waited. At 6:27, Dr. Odom came into the waiting room. She was still wearing her coat from outside, which she'd never taken off, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been fully present for something demanding. And she looked directly at Adrian when she came in, and what he read in her face before she said a word was, "Not the worst. Not the worst. Miles is stable. His heart rate recovered well. We gave Simone medication to bring her blood pressure down, and it's responding. She's at 9 centimeters and moving fast." Pause. "She's going to deliver vaginally. Everything looks like it's going in the right direction." Adrian exhaled. It came out jagged, and he didn't try to smooth it. "Can I?" He started. "She's going to tell you who she wants in the delivery room, doctor," Odom said. "Not unkindly, just directly. That's her call. I'll let her know you're here and she can tell you herself." Dr. Odom left. They waited another 12 minutes. Then Delia came out. She looked at the 3 of them, at Adrian, at Margaret, at Sophie, and she said she'd like Margaret and Sophie. The sentence landed. Sophie's breath caught slightly. She looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Delia. "Okay," he said. "Just that. One word. No argument. No, but I'm the father, or I have a right, or any version of the sentence that would have made it about him rather than about Simone." Sophie was still looking at him. Her eyes were asking something, checking, reading, making sure he was all right, before she moved toward something Simone needed. "Go," he said to her. "She needs you, go." Sophie stood up. She touched his arm once, a brief, deliberate touch. The kind that means something has been communicated that doesn't require language. And then she followed Delia down the corridor and through the doors. Margaret stood. She looked at her son with an expression that was everything pride and sorrow, and the particular complexity of a mother, watching a man become something better than what he'd been at the cost of something he loved. She chose correctly, Margaret said quietly. Then she followed Sophie. Adrian sat back down in the empty waiting room. He sat alone in the yellow light, with the bright overhead fixtures, and the chairs that hurt after an hour, and the particular silence of a hospital corridor before 7 in the morning. And he put his hands on his knees, and he stayed. He did not pace. He had an old habit of pacing movement as a substitute for agency, and he sat still instead. He checked his phone once, saw nothing that required him, and set it face down. He looked at the wall. He looked at his hands. He thought about Miles, about the small person who had been on a monitor all night, whose heart had frightened everyone by slowing and then recovered, who was now moving toward a world that was messier than any of them had planned. He thought about what he would say to him. Not at 6 hours old. Not at 6 months. But eventually, when Miles was old enough to understand that the people who made him had made mistakes, and that mistakes were not the end of a story, that what came after the mistakes was the actual story, that the one that determined what kind of people you were. He thought about what kind of person he was becoming. Slowly, imperfectly, without anyone witnessing most of it. He thought about the 47 files and the 12-page document about Margaret and the note about his own blood type in a document Simone had written in case she couldn't speak for herself. He thought about Sophie saying, "She doesn't have to survive the whole night, only the next minute." He sat in the waiting room at Brigham and Women's Hospital in the hour before dawn on a December morning, and he did not try to be anywhere other than exactly where he was, which was here, which was waiting, which was the only thing he could do and the most honest thing he had done in a very long time. And then at 7:43 in the morning, cutting clean through the corridor silence, a sound that required no interpretation. A newborn cry. Thin and furious and absolutely certain of itself. The cry of someone who has just arrived somewhere difficult and has opinions about it already. Adrian's head dropped forward. His shoulders went first, just dropped, like something had been cut, and the sound that came out of him was not a sound he had made before. Not in this combination. Not with this particular mixture of relief and grief and love, and the specific weight of a man who almost wasn't here for this, who could have been anywhere else, who had spent 8 months building a life adjacent to his own life, and who was here now, in a chair in a waiting room, because he had answered the phone and driven fast and let go of everything that wasn't this. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He breathed. Miles was here. Miles was in the world. And Adrian Vale sat in the waiting room and gave himself exactly 60 seconds of this, of the cracking open, the undignified overwhelm of it, because Miles was here and Simone was alive, and the rest of it, all the rest of it, was going to require him to be steady, and he had 60 seconds before steady was required. He used all 60. Then he wiped his face with both hands. He straightened in the chair. He waited. 40 minutes later, Delia appeared in the doorway of the waiting room. "She'll see you now," she said. He stood. He walked down the corridor and through the first set of doors and down the second corridor, and he stopped outside the room because the door was half open, and through the gap he could see Margaret in a chair near the window with her coat folded in, her lap and Sophie, standing near the bed with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes red in the way of someone who has been crying good tears rather than terrible ones, and he could hear, underneath everything, a small and very specific sound, the sound of a person approximately 40 minutes old, making the preliminary assessments of his new situation. Adrian put his hand on the door. He pushed it open. Simone was in the bed, with her hair loose and her face exhausted past the point where exhaustion has a specific look and becomes simply the look of someone who has gone completely through something and is now on the other side of it. And she was holding Miles. And Miles was the size of something Adrian had no adequate prior experience with, small in the way that makes your chest physically contract. Small in the way that makes the whole world suddenly feel dangerously large. Adrian came in. He came in slowly, with the careful movement of a man who understands that he is entering something rather than reclaiming it. Simone looked up at him. Her eyes were more than tired. They were clear. The clarity of someone who has been through physical extremity and come out the other side without any patience left for anything that isn't true. He came to the side of the bed. He looked at Miles. Miles had his eyes closed and his hands in fists, and his face doing the complicated work of existing outside the body that had contained him for 36 weeks, and Adrian did not have the vocabulary for this, had never had the vocabulary for this, which was perhaps why he had spent his adult life avoiding the things that required it. He was everything. "Can I?" Adrian said. Simone shifted Miles toward him. One careful, deliberate movement. Adrian reached for him with both hands, learning the weight of him, learning the specific and irreplaceable geometry of his son, and Miles's face did something imperceptible, some microscopic adjustment of the features. And his hands unclenched slightly, and Adrian held him and did not move. "Hey," he said, very quietly. To Miles specifically. "Hey, I'm sorry it took me a minute to get here." Simone watched him. Her face was doing something she wasn't trying to manage. Adrian looked up from Miles to her. "I'm sorry," he said, for almost becoming someone he would have had to spend years forgiving. Simone's throat moved. She looked at him holding their son, this man who had broken everything and was slowly, genuinely, too slowly, but genuinely learning to be different. And she said, "You still have time not to." The words settled between them. Not a promise, not a reconciliation, not the beginning of anything that had been before. Just a true thing, said to a man holding a child who was 43 minutes old and already, without doing anything except existing, the most important argument anyone had ever made for the possibility of getting things right. Sophie made a sound from the corner of the room that was half law, half something else, and Margaret looked out the window with her lips pressed together in the particular expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know that this moment, imperfect and complicated and real as it was exactly as good as any moment she had ever witnessed. Miles made a sound, a small, preliminary, entirely self-centered sound. His first opinion. "He's impatient," Sophie said. "Yeah," Simone said softly. "I know where he gets it." And Adrian held his son and did not look away, and did not ask for anything, and did not make any promises that the future hadn't authorized yet. And outside the window, the December sun was coming up over Boston, in the particular cold, clear way it does when the night has been long, and the morning is not gentle, but it is light, and it is here, and that is enough. Then 6 weeks later, on a gray January afternoon, Simone's attorney sent Adrian a document. He knew what it was before he opened it. Divorce papers. He sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen, the same house that had felt hollow for months and was now simply home, without her in it, and he opened the envelope and pulled out the papers and looked at the signature line. He sat there for a long time. Miles was asleep in the bassinet in the nursery, 3 days into his first week at the house, because that was the co-parenting agreement they had worked out in the counseling sessions, practical, detailed, and built entirely around Miles rather than around either of them. He picked up his phone, called Simone. She picked up on the third ring. "I got them," he said. "I know," she said. "Is this—" He stopped. Started again. "Is there anything I could, Adrian?" Her voice was not cold. It was the voice she used when she was being completely honest and completely kind simultaneously, which was a combination he had come to understand was more difficult to maintain than either alone. "You've changed. I see that you've changed. And that matters, it genuinely matters. For Miles, for Sophie, for your parents. But it doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't mean I owe you another version of us." He pressed the heel of his palm against the table. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she asked. Not challenging. Actually asking. He thought about what Dr. Okafor had said about remorse. About the difference between what you lost and what you cost someone else. "Yeah," he said. "I do." A pause. "Then sign them," she said. "And we'll build something better than what we had. Not together." But she paused. Around Miles. Something he can actually count on. Adrian looked at the signature line. He thought about Simone, standing in the cottage doorway in her gray sweater. He thought about the 47 files. He thought about Sophie on the bus to the cottage, and Margaret's Twifte pages, and Richard in the parking lot outside the neurologist's office. He thought about Miles's first cry, cutting through the corridor. He thought about everything that had been, and everything it had cost, and everything that was still possible on the other side of what he had done. And he understood in the specific way you understand things that arrive after a very long time, that this was not a defeat. This was the bill. And he was going to pay it, not because it would give him anything back, but because Miles was 3 days old and watching, and Sophie was 17 and watching, and his parents were aging and watching, and the only version of himself worth being was the one that paid the bill without asking for credit. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. Simone signed the papers on a Tuesday. She signed them at the small kitchen table in the cottage with Miles asleep to Mason-tet. She had positioned near the window so he could have the afternoon light, because she had read somewhere that newborns responded to natural light patterns, and she had verified that information and acted on it, the way she acted on everything quietly, without announcing it, simply doing the thing that served the person who needed serving. The pen moved across the signature line steadily. Her hand did not hesitate. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, had rehearsed it in the way you rehearse things that are final and necessary, and that you need to get through without falling apart in the middle of them. And when it was done, she set the pen down and looked at her signature for a moment, and then looked out the window at the January trees. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected grief in the acute forms, the sudden, breathless kind that arrives when a thing you have been anticipating finally becomes real. Instead, what arrived was something quieter, something closer to the feeling you get when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down, and your arms ache with the absence of the weight, and you stand there adjusting to the strange lightness of your own hands. Miles made a sound in the bassinet, not a cry, just the small preliminary sound of a person stirring toward wakefulness, checking whether the world was still there. Still here, she said, to him, or to herself, or to the room. She wasn't particular about which. She picked up her phone and called her attorney and said, "I've signed. I'm sending them today." Her attorney said, "I'll file as soon as I have them." And then the call was over, and it was done. And Simone sat in the January light for another few minutes before Miles escalated from preliminary sounds to something with more conviction. And she went to him, and she lifted him, and she held him against her chest and felt his weight real and warm and entirely present. And she thought, okay, this is what's real. This is what I build from here. The divorce was finalized on the 14th of February, which Simone discovered when her attorney's email arrived that morning. And she laughed, actually laughed out loud, alone in the cottage kitchen, because the universe had a blunt sense of humor, and she had learned in the last several months to appreciate bluntness in all its forms. She called Renata. "It's done," she said. Renata said, "How do you feel?" Simone thought about it honestly, the way she had been learning to think about things, not searching for the socially correct answer, not performing an emotion she thought was appropriate, but actually checking, actually looking inside at what was there. "Lighter," she said. "I feel lighter." Renata said, "Good. That's exactly right. I applied for that job," Simone said. "The maternal health coordinator position in Cambridge." A pause. Then Renata made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob and covered both. "Simone, I sent the application 3 weeks ago. They called me last week. I have an interview on Thursday. You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to say it out loud until it was real," Simone said. "I didn't want to jinx it by wanting it too much." "You have never jinxed anything in your life," Renata said. "You are constitutionally incapable of jinxing things. You are the person who unjinxes things by arriving." Simone looked at Miles in the bassinet. He was looking at the ceiling with the intense, unfocused concentration of a 6-week-old discovering that ceilings exist. "I want it," Simone said. Simply. I want something that has my name on it. Just mine. Something I built for a reason that has nothing to do with anyone else's calendar." Renata was quiet for a moment. "You're going to get it," she said. "I know," Simone said. And that was the difference. She knew. Not the fragile, conditional knowing of someone hoping they were right, but the solid, clear knowing of a woman who had survived the worst year of her life and discovered that the survival was not an accident. That she was, in fact, exactly as capable as she had always been. That she had not needed anyone to carry her. That she had only ever needed the weight lifted so she could walk. The interview was on a Thursday morning in Cambridge, in a building that smelled like fresh paint and old coffee, which Simone took as a good sign about the priorities of the people who worked there. She had arranged for Margaret to sit with Miles for 2 hours. This had been Margaret's idea, offered over the phone, with the particular firmness of a woman's who has decided on a course of action and does not require your input on whether it's appropriate. She had said, "I'd like to spend time with him, if you'd allow it." She had said allow it, not assumed it, not presumed it, and Simone had felt the care in that word and said yes, of course, yes. Margaret arrived at 8:45 in her good coat, slightly early as always, with a bag that contained what Simone estimated was approximately 4 times the supply needed for a 2-hour visit. She stood in the cottage doorway and looked at Simone at her interview clothes, at her hair, at the careful, quiet composure of a woman walking back toward her own life. And Margaret's expression did something that she quickly controlled, but not before Simone saw it. "You look like yourself," Margaret said. Simone didn't answer that directly. She showed Margaret where everything was Miles's schedule, his feeding times, the specific way he liked to be held when he was fussy, which was upright against your shoulder, with one hand supporting his head and the other flat on his back, and Margaret listened to every word with the attention of someone who understands that. These details are not small, that the whole architecture of a person's care is built from exactly these details. Before Simone left, she paused in the doorway. "Margaret," she said. Margaret was already at the bassinet, looking down at Miles with an expression of absolute, unconsummated tenderness, the expression of a grandmother before she knows anyone is watching. She looked up. "I want you to know," Simone said carefully, "that what's happened between me and Adrian doesn't change anything between me and your family. You, Richard, Sophie, that's not going anywhere. Whatever happens with the legal arrangements, or the co-parenting schedule, or any of it, you're Miles's grandmother. You're part of his life." She stopped, found the right word. "You're part of mine, in whatever shape that takes." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Her chin moved slightly. Then she said, very precisely, "Go get that job, Simone." Simone went and got the job. She started in March, 4 months after Miles was born. 3 days a week initially, and then full-time by May, as Miles adjusted to the rhythm of the childcare arrangement, and Simone adjusted to the rhythm of being Simone Avery again professionally, intentionally, with a business card that had her name on it and a title that she had earned in a previous life and was reclaiming in this one. The work was not easy. It was the work of sitting with women in crisis, pregnant women without resources, new mothers without support, families navigating the particular gauntlet of the medical system when you are frightened and poor and don't speak the language of institutions. Simone was good at it, in the specific way of someone who understands from the inside what it costs to manage difficulty without acknowledgement, what it means to carry things that nobody sees you carrying, and what a person needs most when the carrying has become too much, which is not always practical help, though that matters, but is sometimes simply someone looking at them and saying, "I see what you're doing. I see how hard this is. You're not invisible." She said those things, in various forms, many times a day. She went home tired in a way that was completely different from the exhaustion of managing Adrian's life. That tiredness had been the tiredness of water running out of a container that was never quite refilled. This tiredness was the tiredness of a person who has spent themselves in the right direction. And there is a difference, and the difference is everything. Miles had Adrian's hands. She noticed this at about 3 months, when Miles started making deliberate grasping motions, and she could see the shape of his fingers clearly for the first time, and the recognition landed in her chest with a complexity she sat with, rather than resolved. He had her nose, according to Renata. He had Adrian's hands, and Simone's nose, and his own precise opinionated personality that owed nothing to either of them, and everything to whatever the combination had produced, which was a person who had been in the world for 3 months and already had strong views about the temperature of his formula and the specific stuffed rabbit he preferred to the 4 other stuffed animals in his immediate orbit. The co-parenting was not easy. She had not expected it to be easy, and she had not told herself it would be easy, because she had learned in the last year to stop lying to herself about what things were in order to survive them. It was hard in the specific way of 2 people who had shared a life, trying to operate adjacent to each other without the structure that shared life had provided. There were handoffs that felt clinical and necessary and vaguely heartrending, regardless of how professionally everyone conducted themselves. There were evenings when Miles went to Adrian's house, and the cottage was quiet in a way that had a specific texture to it that was different from chosen solitude. She let herself feel that. She did not reach for her phone during those evenings and call Adrian to discuss logistics. That could wait until morning, which had been a temptation in the early weeks not because she wanted to talk to him, but because the quiet was large, and his voice was a known quantity and old habits are persistent, even when you've outgrown the reason for them. She did not do it. She sat in the quiet and read or called Renata, or, on one Thursday evening, opened her laptop and began writing something she hadn't planned to write, which was a guide for women navigating the maternal health system alone, and which became, over four subsequent Thursday evenings, the outline of a resource document that her supervisor at the Cambridge organization eventually helped her develop into something they could actually distribute. It had her name on it, just hers. She met Julian Cross on a Wednesday in April. Miles was 4 months old and had a pediatric appointment at a practice in Cambridge that Simone had selected with the same methodical care she brought to all decisions, which was to research it thoroughly and then trust the conclusion she reached. Julian Cross was not Miles's primary pediatrician that was a woman named Doctor Park, who had the steady, matter-of-fact warmth that Simone had recognized immediately as exactly right for her son. But he was covering the afternoon when Miles had an unscheduled visit for a low fever that turned out to be nothing, and Julian came into the exam room with the specific manner of a doctor who is fully present, which is rarer than it should be. He was 39, tallish, with the kind of tired around his eyes that speaks to work rather than age. And he had a way of talking to Miles during the exam, narrating what he was doing, in a quiet conversational tone, as if Miles were a participant rather than a subject that Simone noticed and catalogued without intending to. He told her the fever was unremarkable, that Miles was gaining weight well, and his developmental markers were exactly where they should be. He said it, the way good doctors say things, not to reassure her, with a performance of confidence, but to share actual information with someone he was treating as capable of receiving it. On the way out, she spilled her coffee. She had been juggling Miles's carrier and her bag and the cup she had been holding since the waiting room, and something slipped, and the cup hit the floor of the corridor, and the lid came off in a way that distributed the entire contents across a significant portion of the hallway floor. She stood there for a moment, holding Miles in the carrier, looking at the coffee. Julian came around the corner from the exam room and stopped. He did not say anything. He went to the supply closet at the end of the corridor, papered towels, and he crouched down and cleaned up the coffee with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom this is simply the obvious next action, rather than a favor requiring acknowledgement. When it was done, he stood up and looked at her. "That brand of coffee tastes like disappointment anyway," he said. "You're better off." She laughed. It surprised her. It came out sudden and real, and she hadn't felt a laugh arrive that way in a while, hadn't felt it from the actual bottom of something, rather than from the social reflex of appropriate levity. "Thank you," she said. "The cleaning up or the opinion on the coffee?" "Both," she said. He looked at Miles in the carrier. Miles looked back at him with the solemn total attention of a 4-month-old encountering a new face and running a full assessment. "He's deciding whether he likes me," Julian said. "He decides fast," Simone said. "He gets that from me." Julian looked up at her. Something in his expression was simply interested. Not in the way that made her uncomfortable, but in the way that attentive people are interested in someone who is interesting, without agenda, without pressure, just a genuine registering of a person as worth paying attention to. "I hope the verdict is reasonable," he said. "So far, so good," she said. She walked to the exit. She was putting Miles in the car when her phone buzzed with the appointment summary email from the practice, and at the bottom, below Julian's typed notes about the fever and the developmental assessment, there was a line that said, "Feel free to follow up with any questions, JC." It was a standard closing line. She was aware that it was a standard closing line. She also noticed that she had read it twice. She did not do anything about this for 6 weeks. Then, at a follow-up appointment for Miles's 4-month vaccinations, Julian was there again, and after the appointment in the corridor, he asked whether the coffee situation had improved. She said the cottage had a decent machine now. He said, "If you ever want to test it against something more professionally prepared, The place on Hampshire Street was reliably good. She said, "I'm not in a place where coffee means anything other than coffee." He said, "Then coffee can just be coffee." She said, "Okay." It was that simple and that complicated simultaneously. They had coffee 6 times before anything changed. Each time it was coffee. Just coffee. He asked about her work, and she told him about it with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has found the right thing and knows it. And he listened with the specific attention of someone who is genuinely interested rather than performing interest. And she talked about Miles, and he talked about the work of pediatric medicine. And sometimes they disagreed about things in a way that was bracing rather than threatening, and she drove home after each one, feeling something she had almost forgotten the texture of, which was the feeling of being met, not managed, not handled, not appreciated for her usefulness or valued for what she produced. Met as an equal, as a person with opinions that were allowed to be wrong sometimes and right other times, as a woman who could be tired without it being a problem and uncertain without it needing to be fixed. She told Renata about him in June. Renata said, "What's he like?" Simone thought about it. "He cleaned up my spilled coffee without making me feel like he was doing me a favor," she said. "And he talks to Miles like a person." Renata said Simone. "I know," Simone said. "Are you happy?" Renata asked, carefully, because Renata understood that happy was a complicated word after a year like the one Simone had had, and she wasn't using it casually. Simone looked out the window of the cottage at the summer trees. "I'm getting there," she said. "I think I'm actually getting there." In August, 13 months after the night, she had placed her wedding ring in Adrian's palm. He called and asked if they could meet. Not for Miles, not for co-parenting logistics. For something he said he needed to say in person, and had been trying to find the right time to say for months, and had finally decided that there was no right time, and he would simply have to say it when the time was available, rather than waiting for the time to be right. They met at a coffee shop near the harbor. Neutral ground. She arrived before him, which was characteristic, and ordered tea and sat at a table near the window where she could see the water, and she noticed that she was not dreading this the way she might have expected. She was simply waiting, curiously, with some care, but without the particular braced quality of someone waiting for impact. Adrian arrived 4 minutes after the hour, which was a change from the man she had married, who had been reliably 12 minutes late to everything because his time had always belonged first to himself. He looked different than he had in the delivery room. He looked like a man who had been living inside his own life, rather than managing it from a comfortable distance. There were lines around his eyes that were new or newly visible, and his shoulders were set differently, lower, less performed. He looked, she thought, like someone who had put something down that he had been carrying wrong for a long time, and was still learning how his body moved without it. He sat across from her. He ordered coffee. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. Her wedding ring. She looked at it. Small and gold, the specific weight of something that had meant the world at one point, and was now simply an object. She looked at it the way you look at things that have been through the same fire you have, and come out the other side, changed in form, but not destroyed. "I'm not giving it back to wear," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to ask you anything. I'm not here to make a case," for he stopped. "Started again. I just thought it belonged to you, not to me. Those 6 years belong to you too. The good parts of them. You should have something to show for them. That isn't just the damage." She looked at the ring on the table. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "I've been in therapy for 8 months, and I've said a version of this to Dr. Okafor probably 30 times, and I realize that saying it to the therapist instead of to you is..." He pressed his lips together. "It's easier. It's cowardly, actually. So I'm saying it to you." She waited. "I lied to you," he said. "Not just about Camille. I lied to you about what our marriage was, to justify what I was doing outside it. I told her you were difficult, that the pregnancy had changed you, that I'd been unhappy for years." He looked directly at her when he said it did not look away, did not soften the landing. None of that was true. I was a man who wanted to feel uncomplicated, without paying the cost of becoming uncomplicated, and so I outsourced the complications to you, and then resented the work you did managing them, and then went to someone who didn't know about the work, and let her reflect back a version of me that had never had to do any of it. Simone's hands were around her tea mug. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. That's not the point. The point is that I'm saying it out loud to you so that you have it from me directly rather than having had to piece it together on your own. He paused. You spent 6 months wondering whether you were the problem. Camille told me she'd called you. I know what she said. And I know that what I had been saying about you was what gave her the language for it. And that he stopped. His jaw worked. That is the thing I am most ashamed of. Not the affair. Not even the lying, specifically. The fact that I gave someone else a weapon and she used it on you and you had to spend months rebuilding the knowledge that you were not what I'd described. The coffee shop moved around them. Someone ordered something at the counter. A chair scraped. Outside, Boston Harbor glittered in the August light. You were never impossible to love, he said. I want you to hear me say that directly. You were never difficult. You were never boring or diminished by the pregnancy or any of the things I said to make my choices look like responses rather than decisions. You were a woman who loved me well and completely, and I chose over and over to take that as a given rather than a gift. Simone looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him since the hospital. This man, who had broken everything, who was rebuilding himself in the wreckage, who was doing it slowly and genuinely, and too late to save their marriage, and not too late to be someone worth the effort of his own transformation. I know that now, she said. I know I wasn't those things. I've known it for a while. She paused. It took me longer than it should have to know it. That's the part that cost me most. Not the affair. The months of wondering whether you were right. I'm sorry, he said. For every single day of those months. She nodded. She looked at the ring on the table. She picked it up. It was lighter than she remembered. Or her hands were stronger. Possibly both. I'm going to keep it, she said. Not to wear. But Miles should have it someday. He should know something about what was built before him. Even the things that ended. That things can be real and still deserve to end. She closed her hand around it. That's not a sad story. It's just a true one. Adrian looked at her closed hand. Are you happy? He asked. Quietly, without any particular investment in the answer, she realized without the question being about him. Just asking. She thought about Julian cleaning up her coffee without making it a favor. She thought about Miles's hands. She thought about her name on the resource document, the job in Cambridge, the cottage with the summer trees, and the pipes that had stopped making that sound once the season changed. I'm becoming happy, she said. Genuinely. Not performed for anyone happy. The real kind. Good, he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. Are you? She asked. He considered it with the seriousness of someone who has learned to take the question seriously. I'm learning what I actually am without someone else managing the hard parts, he said. It's uncomfortable. I'm better for it. He paused. Miles makes me better for it. Every time he looks at me, I think about who I want him to see when he's old enough to see people clearly. Who do you want him to see? She asked. Someone who showed up, Adrian said. That's all. Just someone who showed up and didn't require anyone else to make it look effortless. She thought about Simone's own father, who had been that, who had been exactly that, without once calling it anything, who had shown up in the ordinary and unremarkable way that turns out, over time, to be the most significant way of all. That's enough, she said. That's actually exactly enough. Sophie's college acceptance party happened on a Saturday evening in October, 14 months after the night that had changed everything, at a restaurant near Boston Harbor that Rachel had chosen, and Margaret had approved, and Adrian had paid for, and Simone had told Sophie she didn't have to have if she'd prefer something smaller. And Sophie had said, no, I want everyone there. 6 months. I want to see what it looks like when everyone is in the same room and it doesn't cost anything. So they were all in the same room. Rachel Vale, who had divorced Adrian 6 years before Simone arrived in his life, was the first person to embrace Simone when she walked in, which was either deeply ironic or exactly as it should be, depending on your perspective. And Simone thought it was the latter. Rachel was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about the restaurant's wine selection, and had clearly been working very hard over many years at not letting her feelings about Adrian contaminate her co-parenting. And Simone respected this work enormously, because she understood what it cost. Richard was there, steadier than he'd been at the last gathering, his left hand quiet night, tonight Margaret, beside him, in the particular way of a woman who has spent 50 years learning exactly how close to stand Richard shook Simone's hand when she arrived and held it for a moment and said, "You look well." And she said, "I am." And he said, "Good. That's the right answer." Julian came. He came because Simone had asked him, not tentatively or with extensive qualification, but with the directness she had reclaimed. In the last year, the directness of a woman who has stopped hedging about what she wants. "I'd like you to come." He had said yes the same way. Without performance, "I'd like to come." And he was there, slightly overdressed, because she had not properly described the occasion. And he had aired formal, and he stood beside her at the bar, with a glass of something he had selected, without consulting her. And she thought about that, about how he made his own choices, and stood by them, without requiring her endorsement, and she felt the small specific warmth of it. Adrian arrived alone. He came in with the particular composure of a man who has prepared for a hard thing, and arrived anyway. And he moved through the room and embraced his mother and shook Richard's hand and kissed Rachel on the cheek with the ease of people who have been navigating a complicated arrangement long enough that it has become simply their arrangement. And then he found Simone. He saw Julian beside her, and his face did something that resolved itself in about 2 seconds into something clear and controlled and real. He crossed the room. He shook Julian's hand. "Adrian Vale," he said. "I know," Julian said. "Julian Cross." "A beat." "She says good things about the practice," Adrian said, which was not what he would have said a year ago. A year ago, he would have found a way to make the introduction about himself. "She says good things about Miles," Julian said, "which is what matters." Adrian almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "it is." He moved on. He found Sophie, who was across the room in a dress she had selected herself, and heels she was managing with. Approximately the confidence of someone who had decided to be confident, rather than someone who was naturally at ease in heels. And he stood beside her and said something that made her laugh, really laugh, not the careful laugh she kept in reserve. And Simone watched them from across the room and felt the specific, complicated relief of something that has been broken beginning in its new shape to hold. Dinner was long, and the conversation moved in all directions, and Miles sat in Rachel's lap for 20 minutes, and then Adrian's, and then was returned to Simone with the ease of people who have been practicing, and Julian passed him a cracker at some point, and Miles considered it with great seriousness before accepting it, which the table found collectively charming, in the way of an audience that has agreed, for the evening, to find things charming. Toward the end of dinner, Sophie stood. She held her water glass, because she had said before she stood that she was not a champagne person, and she wasn't going to pretend to be one just because there was something to celebrate, which was both characteristic and exactly right. She spoke for a few minutes. She spoke about what she had learned in the last year, about families that they were not fixed things, not permanent arrangements that either held or shattered, but living things that changed shape around the people inside them, and that sometimes the shape had to change dramatically before it could become something that actually worked. She said she had once believed that love meant nobody left. She said she understood now that people could be present every day and still be absent in the ways that mattered, and that sometimes someone leaving was what finally made presence possible. She thanked Rachel. She thanked Adrian. She looked at Simone. "Thank you," she said, "for never making me earn a place in your life. You just opened the door, and you kept it open. And I didn't know how rare that was until I needed to know." Simone pressed her lips together. Sophie said, "And I'm going to figure out how to do that for other people, because you showed me it was possible." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rachel said, "Okay." Someone opened the champagne, in the voice of a woman who has been holding back emotion by force of will and needs an action to move toward, and the table laughed, and the champagne was opened, and the moment passed into the ordinary current of the evening. Under the table, Julian's hand found Simone's. Not a dramatic gesture, not a claim, just a hand finding hers in the particular quiet way of someone who is simply there. She let it stay. Later, much later, after the restaurant had cleared, and Miles was asleep in his carrier, and Julian had gone to get the car, and Sophie was outside on the phone, and Rachel and Richard and Margaret had said their goodbyes, Adrian found Simone alone for a moment near the harborside window. He stood beside her, not close enough to intrude, close enough to speak without the rest of the room. Outside, the harbor was dark and lit in the way Boston always was not beautiful in the obvious ways that advertised their beauty, but particular, recognizable, the specific beauty of a place you have been long enough to know its moods. She's going to be okay, Adrian said. About Sophie. She was always going to be okay, Simone said. She just needed someone to believe it first. He was quiet for a moment. You were always better at that than me, he said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. You're learning, she said, and she meant it. She could see him learning. In the small evidence of each interaction tonight, the way he had introduced himself to Julian without making it a contest, the way he had stood beside Sophie without steering her, the way he had shaken Richard's arm when they arrived, rather than the brief shoulder pat of a son performing affection. Small things. The small things were the real things. She had always known that. Miles looked at me tonight, Adrian said, like I was someone he recognized. She turned and looked at him. He recognizes you, she said. That's yours. You built that. Adrian looked out at the harbor. I built it 4 months in, he said. You built it for years without anyone noticing. Someone noticed, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze and she said, I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't know how to say that the noticing wasn't enough. That I needed you to notice too. She paused. That's on both of us. Not equally. But both. He took that in the way he had learned to take things in without deflecting, without rushing to counter-argue, without organizing it into a shape that cost him less. Thank you for that, he said. She looked back at the harbor. Go home, Adrian, she said, not unkindly. The way you say something true, that is also gentle. Go home and remember Richard's appointment in the morning and call your mother before she has to call you. And be who Miles is going to remember. Yeah, he said. He didn't move for another moment. Then he said, for what it's worth. The 6 years. Most of them were... I was lucky. I just didn't know it until I'd spent it. She said nothing. She let that sit. He put on his coat and said goodnight. She watched him move through the emptied restaurant, toward the door, and she watched him stop and hold the door for a stranger coming in from outside. And she thought about all the ways you become someone, the 1,000 small choices that accumulate into character. And she thought that maybe he was becoming someone worth the effort of his own life. She hoped so. For Miles, for Sophie, for Richard and Margaret, for the man himself, whatever he was capable of becoming. She turned back to the window. Julian appeared outside, with the car double parked on the street below, and she could see him through the glass, looking up at the restaurant, looking for her. When he found her in the window, he raised one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement, just, I'm here, and she lifted hers back. Miles stirred in the carrier at her chest. She put her hand over him, felt him settle. That small, particular weight of a person becoming himself, hour by hour, in the arms of someone who was doing the same. She thought about the night she had removed her ring, the kitchen, the rain on the window, the moment when something inside her had gone, and she had understood, for the first time in months, that the stillness was not defeat, but clarity, that she was not standing in the wreckage of everything she had. She was standing at the beginning of everything she was going to build. She had been right. She picked up her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the restaurant into the October night, and the air was cold and clear in the way of nights that have something definitive about them. And Julian was there with the car and the engine running, and Miles awake now, blinking at the city's lights in the carrier at her chest, with his father's hands and her nose and his own absolute, uncompromising self. She got in the car. She buckled Miles's carrier. She looked out at Boston, moving past the window familiar, and changed. The same city she had driven out of at 4 a.m, with 2 suitcases and a hospital bag, and the specific, terrifying freedom of a woman who has chosen herself. And she felt, simply, here. Not healed exactly. Not finished. Not arrived at some final uncomplicated version of things. Just here, in a moving car on an October night, with a child who was 6 months old and learning the world, and a man beside her who cleaned up her coffee without making it a favor, and somewhere behind her a man who had broken everything and was learning, in the ash of it, who he actually was. She thought about what she had told Miles in the hospital, alone, with her blood pressure coming down, and his heartbeat steady on the monitor. We're going to be okay. She had believed it then, without knowing how. Now she knew how. You become okay, the way you become anything not in one moment, but in the accumulation of choices. In the slow, unglamorous, unwitnessed work of deciding every day to be someone worth being, and then doing the small things that prove it, and then doing them again. Miles reached up and found her finger in the dark of the car. She let him hold it. She looked out at the city. She was not carrying anyone else's life tonight. She was simply exactly here inside her own. And that, after everything, was enough. That was after everything. Exactly enough.